On February 22nd, when Dan Gables clicked the button on his garage door opener, he was completely oblivious to the threat that lay next to him. Dan was a reporter for the Chronicle and had established a reputation as a hard-hitting reporter who pulled no punches. When corruption was rife, Dan was willing to keep sifting through the dirt and mud to find the truth. That's why on this cold evening in Ohio, when the snow had fallen and created a blanket around his home, Dan wouldn't have thought he was in any more danger than he was any other night of the year. But cloaked in the shadows lay an attacker waiting patiently for the time to strike. And strike he did, with fury and venom. As the dawn broke on February 23rd, a neighbor spotted a lifeless body strewn under the bushes that divided his property with Dan Gables' home. Quickly he checked to see if there was a pulse or a breath coming from the person on that frosty morning, but frantically he realized this person had met some awful ending. He called 911 and, stammering through an explanation, let them know what he had uncovered. That's when the mystery began. As paramedics arrived, they rapidly determined that the body had passed. The stab wounds to the neck, chest and abdomen were too severe for any person to withstand them, and the pool of blood seeping from the body to the surrounding icy snow revealed the true horror of what had happened the night before. It wasn't long before they had established that it was the famed reporter Dan Gables who lay before them. But who would have stalked this revered investigative journalist? The challenge was not trying to identify a suspect, but which of the many suspects who may well be responsible. You see, Dan was fearless, and his career spanned decades. He had crossed paths with the wickedest of criminals, and up until then, had lived to tell many tales. One of Dan's favorite stories was of the time he came face to face with Pablo Escobar in 1992, right before his downfall. Fearlessly, he had commanded Escobar to pull his goons away and stop tailing him. Instead, they had captured him, blindfolded him, and transported him to Colombia. The odds of him escaping that meeting with Pablo were virtually non-existent, but somehow Escobar admired the journalist's resolve in the face of adversity and let him go. Perhaps it was his bravery when confronted with certain death. Maybe it was his commitment to seeking the truth no matter how dire the circumstances. Whatever the reason, Dan shared afterwards that Escobar had smiled and shook his head as he walked away from the confrontation with Dan. Subsequently, he instructed his men to escort Dan back unharmed to the U.S. Dan viewed his kidnapping as a badge of honor. He had flown a little too close to the sun like Icarus, but he had survived. Clearly he was close to the truth when Pablo himself was going to go to such lengths to stop him, but he wouldn't stop, and he didn't. His reporting was widely credited with exposing the most dangerous cartels in Colombia and bringing to light the extent of the drug problem in the United States. Back at the newsroom where Dan had worked every day for 31 years, word had quickly spread of his fate. Together, his former colleagues resolved to find out the culprit. Daunting as the task was to identify the assailant of the dozens or even hundreds of candidates, they committed to doing so. They began by scouring Dan's notes. Who had he been meeting with most recently? Who had he been investigating? Who had he exposed in recent articles? Pent-up resentments from old foes were less likely the reason for the attack as much as recent articles on newly spotlighted criminals. After all, the attack was vicious and brutal. This wasn't a shot to the head but hand-to-hand combat, up close and personal with a dagger and numerous stab wounds. Whoever it was, they were furious at Dan, and that meant they were emotional. Usually high emotions are a sign of recent rage more so than some long-held grudge. Soon they honed in on one possible culprit, Dana Fanning. He was the Attorney General responsible for prosecuting cases and upholding the law of the land. In fact, he was mired up to his neck in scandals, and Gables was set to expose him.
Fanning, a married family man with 3 kids, had been accused of having a secret affair with his young staffer, a recently graduated Ivy League lacrosse player. In a stunning turn of events, Gables had video footage of the two entering a hotel together and walking into the same room on 3 separate occasions. Each time, the two exited the room together within an hour, and with hair and suits looking a little more ruffled than when they entered. While the meetups didn't alone convict Fanning, they were damning. After all, Fanning could argue he wanted an off-site meeting with a close confidant away from prying eyes and listening ears. But the reality was hard to ignore, and apparently the Attorney General had got wind of the upcoming article in the Chronicle that would surely make front-page news. As the journalists dug into the evidence and shared what they had uncovered with investigators, a new bombshell was released. Fanning's DNA had been found under Gables' fingernails. That put Fanning, the Attorney General, in close proximity to Gables. right before he was murdered. It was an extraordinary revelation because it also suggested Gables must have known he was going to die. And even then, in those horrific moments being stabbed, he had his wits about him. He wasn't going to let his attacker get away with it, so he reached out to scratch him and ensure his DNA was under his fingertips, a desperate final act in the hopes that someone would later discover the DNA and have evidence to convict his killer. As the case mounted against Fanning, a media circus was created. But the truth surfaced in the end. 6 months later, in court, Fanning was convicted of premeditated first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. It remains the first and last time an attorney general targeted an investigative journalist in such a horrific manner, and ranks among the worst crimes in America. So that'll do it for today's story, but if you haven't already, tell us what you think of this case. Do you think Gables intentionally reached out to Fanning to scratch off his DNA? And was life without parole for the Attorney General the right sentence? Plus, don't forget, if you haven't already done so, to smash the like button and subscribe for more riveting crime and mystery stories.